Greetings, ESL 52. This is Mr. Kole here with your video lecture as promised for James McBride's The Color of Water, our book here. Okay, we're going to be looking at some very specific chapters in the book today. We'll be looking at chapter 14, 15, and 16. Okay, so chapter 14 is entitled Chicken Man. Interesting title, no doubt. And this is where we will begin our discussion. Okay, so either you may watch this video lecture prior to or after your reading of the chapter. But what I'm going to engage with now is some chapter analysis. All right, there's a number of things that I want to talk to you all about with this chapter. Okay. So first of all, Chicken Man, well, we should probably identify who this man is from the beginning. Chicken Man is a member of the community in Kentucky that James McBride is sent to. He's very unique in that he's probably the most extreme among the African American community that James encounters. Okay. And Chicken Man represents something very important in James McBride's life. He represents a change. He teaches James something which James uses to turn his life around, as we might say, or to begin improving his life, or to begin living more properly, more safely. No drugs. Okay, so when we say properly, I simply mean safety and drug use and alcohol use, because Chicken Man represents danger and alcohol abuse. Okay. But let's begin the chapter first, because the chapter doesn't begin in Kentucky. As you all know, the chapter begins in New York, where James lives. And what we see as an introduction to this chapter is the further deterioration of McBride's self as a adolescent, as a young man. Okay, so we get some details of what it was like for McBride and some of the crimes that he commits. We get specific details about him robbing train yards and getting nearly caught a number of times, which if he had ever gotten caught, he would have spent a long time in prison and perhaps wouldn't have become the man that he is today. Okay. So specifically within Chicken Man, I want to look at page 107 in my text. I know my hardcover is a little bit different from some of the soft covers. But page 107 in the text, beginning with the paragraph which says, "My new friends and I shoplifted." Okay, so you might need to pause the video to find the passage. I'm interested in about 5 lines down in this paragraph with the episode of encountering the police. So we've been discussing themes of racism in the South through Ruth McBride's experience, or Ruth Jordan's experience, depending on which last name she's using. But we've experienced racism through the experience of the South. But in these themes, we want to contrast South and North, the locations, the type of cultures that are found within each of these locations. Racism in the North isn't as overt and it isn't as discussed in the novel. However, in this passage that I'm referencing, page 107, we have a police officer who is quite racist. So we can't analyze the North as being free of racism. There is a quite violent quote that's found within here, the police officer referring to James and his friends, stating, "I'll shoot you right now." He knows that they are trespassing, but they haven't been caught with any stolen goods. But this police officer says he will shoot them right now, and refers to them in a derogatory term, which is typical of racist individuals, using derogatory terms. Okay. James is further deteriorating into the use of marijuana. into the use of LSD, into the use of alcohol, into the use of crime as a means of escaping. He escapes through substance abuse, as it's called, substance abuse being drugs and alcohol, and he is also escaping into crime. His mother still cares about him, obviously, and she wants to change him. But what does she do to discipline her children? She beats them. She physically beats them. We would probably call that physical abuse in modern day and time. At the bottom of page 107, the same paragraph which contained the information about the racist police officer in New York, we have, as a result of staying out late and using drugs, his mother whipped him mercilessly with tears in her eyes, but it did not help. My friends became my family, and my family and my mother just became people I lived with. Okay. This is very important because it expresses two main ideas. It expresses the fact that his mother no longer has control over him, and her methods of beating him, which were effective as a child, are becoming no longer effective as he's an older man or an older young man. He's robbing drug dealers on the streets. How is a woman hitting him with a belt going to change his mentality? Well, of course it doesn't. Equally here within this quote, my friends became my family, and my family and my mother just became people I lived with. You see, James is separating himself from his mother's situation. She has been a widow twice. She is raising a very large amount of children, and James, instead of helping her, is choosing to separate himself from her. And he does this emotionally because he does care about his mom. He loves her. But in order for him to behave in this way, using drugs and committing crimes, he must free himself of his emotional attachment to his mother. Otherwise, he would feel bad for these things. Remember in an earlier chapter, his mother was mugged on the street. She was robbed on the street. And James McBride witnessed this. But then you see later on in life, he's mugging people in the exact same way as he had mugged people before. So he does it, one, to emotionally separate himself from his mother so he can commit crimes and not feel regret. Equally, on page 108, this chapter begins, I was obviously hiding and angry as well, but I would never admit that to myself. Doesn't hiding sound quite similar to running? Well, Ruth McBride is very much a runner, as we've discussed in class. She wants to get away from her problems. Well, here we have James McBride outrightly analyzing himself as hiding and running. As a kid, what he believed is that he was getting back at the world for injustices he had suffered, quoting directly from 108. So in his mind, he justifies his actions by saying he's getting back at society, and he allows himself to commit these crimes by emotionally disconnecting himself from his mother. Okay, so we see that James is becoming disconnected to his family, and as a result is becoming a more negative person. And this contributes to the idea of family and how family helps us. Okay, so remember the theme of familial relationships or family relationships. Okay. But this isn't the main point of the Chicken Man chapter, of course. The main point is meeting Chicken Man. Well, as a result of all of this negative behavior, Ruth McBride, James McBride's mother, decides to send him to Kentucky to meet her relatives. And these relatives are now going to take care of James. Well, James is dropping out of school. He's flunking out of summer school. He actually likes going to Kentucky. He feels like he's more of a free person there. He's hanging out with African Americans. His white mother is nowhere nearby. so he doesn't feel ashamed or uncomfortable because his mother is far away from him. Well, this is where we see James at what might be called a fork in the road. James has two options at this point in his life, and he has to make a decision. Does he want to follow the life of crime, violence, drinking, drug use, no responsibility, or does he want to change for the good? Well, Chicken Man helps him make this decision. He does. Even though Chicken Man himself is not a very respectable man. Okay. So, James McBride enters this culture on the corner, or as they would have pronounced it in Kentucky, the Kona. Okay, so they delete that R sound in their pronunciation, which is an example of diction. Remember, your stylistic device is diction. Okay. So he's hanging out on the corner, immersed in African American culture, a kind of African American culture as well. I should preface that. And this kind of culture is for all ethnicities, actually. It was more of a coincidence that these African Americans were immersed in this kind of life of irresponsibility. This is not typical of the African American experience, as we see with McBride, who publishes books. So let me not say, it's important that we distinguish the corner as a cultural construct and African Americans as a cultural construct. There are many different kinds of African Americans. But James McBride is immersed in this corner. He's immersed around other African Americans, and he's drinking and smoking weed. So it's a perfect escape. Not only has he escaped mentally from his mother by using drugs, but he's also physically escaped from her. So he begins to feel comfortable within this lifestyle. Okay? So he's comfortable within this lifestyle. He starts to think that maybe he wants to live his life this way, doesn't he? Okay. Well, what happens? He gets into an argument at work and decides that he wants to retaliate. He wants revenge. He wants to turn to violence to solve his problem. Well, he starts ranting on this concept to Chicken Man himself. And Chicken Man gives us a very important quote which changes McBride's life, which is found on page 114, beginning the paragraph, Chicken Man chuckled. Okay, so James McBride is saying, I'm going to retaliate with violence. And this is the kind of man I want to be. Chicken Man chuckles, which means he laughs. Chicken Man says, you don't know shit from Shinola. Well, pardon my French. I won't utter any derogatory terms, but this is a very powerful statement. Okay? So, what does that mean? Well, essentially it means, James, you have no idea what you're talking about. You don't know about the life that you're moving into. Okay? You want to go to jail, Chicken Man asks McBride. Well, McBride tries to defend himself, saying he is a smart man. And Chicken Man retorts, saying, why'd you flunk school if you're so smart, James? Okay? So this is a process in which James really begins to analyze his own experience and the decisions he's making and the consequences that they'll have. Well, Chicken Man has this advice. Don't live on this corner. Don't be drinking all day. Don't turn to violence. Well, what happens to Chicken Man? Chicken Man does not follow his own advice. He continues drinking, continues womanizing, continues to live this negative life of no responsibility, dependency on alcohol. Well, Chicken Man dies as a result of this. He is stabbed, right? In a liquor store waiting to buy a beer, he's stabbed. This is the experience which changes James McBride forever. He sees a man living a life a certain way and ending up dead because of it. Well, Chicken Man, in a sense, saved James McBride's life by giving his own. Okay, so this is our Chicken Man video lecture. What I want to move in next to is chapter 15, which is graduation. Alright, so all of these experiences with Chicken Man, these are occurring as Ruth McBride is an adult, okay, sending her son off. But back into graduation, we move back in time, back to Suffolk. And at this moment, Ruth McBride is becoming a woman. She's graduating from high school. She's starting to have opinions of her own, is a specific quote. So what does this chapter signify? Well, in addition to moving forward with her life, we see that Ruth has some decisions to make. If you remember from the previous chapter, she's already been to New York. And she loves the New York lifestyle. She loves going fast. Remember, she likes to run. Well, then she comes back to Suffolk because she can't keep up with school. So she needs to graduate. After her abortion, she meets back with her boyfriend, and he has cheated on her. So he has not been true to her. He got another girl pregnant. So even though this was her first serious African-American male relationship, it ends unsuccessfully. Okay? Which, you have to hand it to her. You wouldn't be able to respect her as much if she didn't stand up for herself. If you are cheated on, I don't recommend staying with the individual. Okay. But here we have, within Ruth, we see her Jewish roots coming through. Okay. This chapter is very much about conflict and Ruth's own struggle for her identity, her own conflict of identity. Well, we see her pulled in one direction towards African American culture, which accepts her, towards people who love her and respect her, which she does not receive from her own family. Yet, she still is connected to her family very deeply, and we see examples of that in her behavior in this chapter. Okay? Even within her own friend, Frances, we see her being torn between Frances and family. Okay? Frances convinces her to go to graduation, but within Suffolk, if you want to graduate at this time, you had to participate in a Christian ritual or a Christian ceremony. Okay? And Ruth wants to stay with Frances and choose family over her, choose her friend and her desire to be with her friend over her family. Well, we see Ruth walk right up to the church, but she's unable to enter the church. Why do you all think that is? Well, it's because she still has these Jewish cultural roots within her heart. She hasn't let go of them yet. Eventually she does. She's forced to. But as of right now, she is very much someone in conflict about who she is. And it's very interesting to see how she reacts to this, because she doesn't go into the church. Okay? She hasn't let go of her past, of pain, and of cultural requirements. Okay. All right. We also see racial tensions within here. She tries to think that she is able to have a biracial relationship within Suffolk, but that, of course, is not possible. Okay? But even though she could not walk into the church, she still is not able to stay in Suffolk. Okay? She's not able to do that. And we see that because she is terrified of her family and she's terrified of becoming her family. Okay, so she still has her Jewish roots in her heart, and she can't go into the church. But yet her fear of becoming like her mother, unloved, subject to an arranged marriage, which potentially could be loveless. She doesn't want to enter a loveless marriage for the rest of her life. Specifically, my example is on page 119. This paragraph begins with, "I made up my mind then that I was going to leave Suffolk for good." Okay, about 10 or 12 lines down, she says, "That's why I knew I was leaving home. I wasn't going to have an arranged marriage like my parents did. I'd rather die first," which I did do in a way, because I lost my mother and my sister when I left home. So she chooses herself and her own desires over sacrificing herself for her mother's needs and for her sister's needs. Okay? So we see this conflict. This chapter is really about Ruth's own identity crisis and how she deals with it. She chooses her own happiness over Jewish cultural expectations. Okay. Alright, so that's pretty much all I wanted to say in terms of the graduation chapter. So let's move on to driving. It's a very exciting chapter. We move back from the past in Suffolk all the way back into Brooklyn during James McBride's life as an adolescent. Here we begin to see McBride turn around, James McBride. He is less of a criminal. He chooses to stop using drugs, stops robbing people, and starts focusing back on his mother. Okay, so begins to emotionally reattach himself. Right. So we talked about the car just a little bit in class and what that car represents. Well, in the beginning of Chicken Man, back to chapter 14, in the first paragraph, we have Daddy's gold Pontiac sat in the front of the house for months, leaves gathering around the tires and bird crap gathering on its hood. "I'm going to learn to drive it," she promises, but instead she starts riding her bike. So what does this car represent? It represents her inability to let go. So in the chapter on Chicken Man, she is unable to drive the car or to sell the car because it represents something that's really valuable to her in her past. Okay? But fast forwarding to driving, we have Ruth claiming her present moment. Okay, so she's very much detached from her own family, and she's very much detached emotionally from the world. She's wandering about, standing in front of the dishes for hours, crying, screaming at her children to get away from her when they come to ask questions. This is not Ruth McBride. This is a depressed Ruth McBride. So, driving. Okay. We have some background information about the father and one car being stolen. Okay, but he gets another car, and we have a very important line on page 125, which represents wisdom. Okay, this is some of the wisdom which McBride is now trying to master as his own, and the wisdom is his identity. Okay, this paragraph begins, but those days were gone, and I'm about 20 lines after that first sentence. The quote is, "You have to choose between what the world expects of you and what you want for yourself." And this is Jack from Kentucky telling McBride that he needs to claim what he wants and not what others are expecting of him. Okay? But as he refuses to continue using drugs, he starts to understand about his mother's recovery. Right? He's beginning to really gain a grasp on the situation like an adult would. Well, at this point, we are sinking farther into the mother's depression as James McBride is coming out of his. All right, so we see that James McBride is moving on an upward plane, just in terms philosophically. How is he living? He's starting from crime and moving into positivity. Well, the mother, she was always up here, largely due to her religious beliefs, as McBride says. We see his mother spiraling downward. Okay? And James realizes that he's partly responsible for that. So he's really making an effort to bring his mother back up with him into positivity. All right, so that's the context we're in right now. And all this time that the mother is in decline, the car sits out front of her house. She's unable to let it go. Well, what better way to confront depression than to confront the memories that cause depression? Well, his mother wants to go driving. And this is a very important moment because it's telling the reader, and it represents the fact that she is going to claim her past. She's going to confront it and become a better person because of it. And that's exactly what she does. But the experience is quite terrifying for James, and James is holding an infant sister, Z. Okay. So I'm on page 129 in my text, and we have James McBride saying, "Watch it. What are you doing, Ma? Stop the car." Okay, the voice of reason is now coming from James instead of the mother. The mother has nearly lost her mind. She's saying, "I need to go to A&P. I need to go to A&P." She shrieked. "That is what I'm driving for, right?" Let me read that statement again. That is what I'm driving for, right? She doesn't know what she's driving for exactly. This sentence has two meanings. Yes, she's driving to go to the A&P. This is true. But she's also driving to confront her past, which is laden with pain. Her past hurts her. She wants to confront that fear. Okay. So this quote is followed by another paragraph that begins with, "The irony was that Mom knew how to drive before she was 18. Remember, in Suffolk, she was driving packages from her dad's store across to different cities. So she was driving. But it seemed like she had forgotten." He gives many details about the types of driving that she engaged with, but she completely forgot how to drive as an adult. Well, this contrast represents her past, which she has left behind and forgotten as well. Okay, so we really have two separate ideas that Ruth McBride is confronting. She's confronting her past, her refusal to drive, right? She essentially wants to be unlike, she wants to change the person she is in New York. Okay, so she doesn't want to be like the girl that was in Suffolk. All right? So the girl in New York rides the subway. The girl in Suffolk drives tractors. Okay, so as she chooses to drive, she is also confronting the person she was in the past. Okay, so we have pain from life in Suffolk, and we have pain from losing her second husband, whom the car belonged to. Okay, so driving represents an enormous change for Ruth McBride. Okay, it's how she confronts her depression and chooses to pull herself up out of it. Okay, so we have two important analyses here. We have the experience of James and how he chose to stop being a criminal and chose to live good. And we have Ruth McBride, who undergoes a change from being depressed into reclaiming her identity as a mother, an effective mother, and a mother that cares and is engaged with her children. All right. One more point that I want to bring up which hasn't come up yet in class. And I'm going way back to the beginning. I'm in the New Testament chapter. Okay? And specifically, I'm on page 39 of the New Testament chapter. Okay? The New Testament chapter is chapter 6, on page 39. Remember, we're talking about how James McBride forms his identity. Okay? James McBride is walking down the street with his mother as a child. Okay, James McBride is a child at this point. They're talking about God and racial identity and trying to work out the problems of racial identity in their logic of how they perceive God. Okay. James McBride asks whether God is black or white. His mother sighs deeply. She's been through this with many other children, these same questions, I'm sure. A deep sigh. Oh boy. God's not black. He's not white. He's a spirit. Okay? Articulating the fact that religious belief transcends human race and problems. James McBride then asks, does he like white or black people better? He loves all people. He's a spirit, his mother responds. What's a spirit? A spirit's a spirit. What color is God's spirit? Okay. He's confused. He wants to make logic out of his concept of a deity, of a God. And you can't always do that. That's why they say faith in religions. God's spirit doesn't have a color, his mother responds. God is the color of water. Water doesn't have a color. Again, God is the color of water. Water doesn't have a color. And of course, that is the title of your book, The Color of Water. So my challenge to you all, as you ponder this video lecture and prepare for our next class, my challenge is that you ponder, what does it mean? What does she mean when she says God is the color of water? Because McBride automatically responds, I could buy that, which means he could believe it and he could understand it. And that leads to other problems for other brothers and sisters. But again, my challenge to you is, what does Ruth McBride mean when she says God is the color of water? Okay? I appreciate everyone taking the time to watch the video lecture, and I look forward to discussing it in our next class. Have a wonderful day.